plan, procure, and deploy a PIV-enabled PAC system. This is the third in a series of educational webinars on PIV-enabled PACs produced by our Educational Institute and Access Control Council under the Secure Technology Alliance. My name is Randy Vanderhoof, and I'm the Executive Director of the Secure Technology Alliance, and some of you may know us from our earlier name, the Smart Card Alliance, which was changed in March of 2017 to the Secure Technology Alliance. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation after the webinar has been concluded. Also, there'll be time at the end for questions, and I encourage listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard that is available on your screen. I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A, and I encourage you to submit questions while the speakers are presenting so we have time to organize them in advance and so we can get to as many of them as possible. So next slide. Let me introduce the other presenters who will be on today's webinar. So first we'll have Lars Suneborn, and he's the Director of Training Programs for the Secure Technology Alliance and former chair of the Access Control Council. And prior to joining the Alliance, he spent many years as a PAC system engineer, sales, and security expert for several global security organizations. We have Mike Kelley, who is Principal Electronic Security System Technical Specialist for Parsons Corporation. And we have Mark Steffler, who is VP of Government Practice at Quantum Secure, an HID global company. All three of these gentlemen are active participants in the Secure Technology Alliance Access Control Council, one of many industry councils which are part of the Secure Technology Alliance organization. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the organization, here's a brief overview. So the mission of the organization is, as a nonprofit, we're a multi-industry association working to stimulate the understanding, adoption, and widespread application of secure solutions. We provide this in a collaborative, member-driven environment to do education and information sharing on how both smart cards and other forms of secure technology like embedded chip technology and related hardware and software can be adopted across all markets in the United States. Now that's a pretty broad mission, but if you look to the right column there, you see the principal markets that we focus our activities towards, and they include access control, which is the subject of today's webinar, also authentication, healthcare, identity management, the Internet of Things, mobile payments, as well as transportation. So as a cross-industry member-supported organization, we do the following things to educate and stimulate the market by bringing together stakeholders who effectively can collaborate on promoting secure solutions technologies and addressing challenges, publishing white papers, webinars like today's, other workshops, newsletters, position papers, and web content. We do conference events and symposiums that focus on specific market areas and technologies. We offer education and training and industry certification programs to promote professional development. We provide networking opportunities for professionals to share their ideas and knowledge and learn from each other. And we produce strong industry communications through public relations, web resources, as well as a social media presence. If you go to the next slide, shining a spotlight specifically on the Access Control Council, their specific focus is around accelerating the widespread acceptance, use, and application of secure technologies in various forms of physical and logical access control. So the group does this through an open forum environment, leading users and technologists from both the public as well as the private sector. And the column on the right is a short list of the many white papers and resources that the Council has produced over time, including topics around the ICAM roadmap and implementation guidance, which is so important to today's government access control and security market, understanding the FIPS 201 standards for use and access control, some guidance for architects and engineers on how to implement PACS in a non-government environment, the role of smart cards and the use of biometrics and access control systems, discussions around logical access control, and also the use of PIV-I in credentialing for payments or for access control and use as well on mobile devices. So with that introduction, I would like to turn the session over to Lars Suneborn, who's going to talk about the National Training Center and our training programs. Lars?
Thank you very much, Randy. Next slide, please. I'm, as Randy said, Lars Suneborn, and I am the director of the Training and Education Program. I am usually in the Security Technology Alliance Educational Institute and Certification Center in Crystal City, Virginia. Certification courses and certification programs that we offer are based on various industry segments. We have a generic smart card certification, and certificates there prove that they have a broad-based generic understanding of smart card technology fundamentals, security, applications, data management, identity and access control use models, cryptography, and commercial identity management and credentialing. We have a different version of that is called CSCIP-P, and that is focused specifically on the payment industry. And as you may have noticed, we all have received new credit cards and debit cards. And for many years, we have collaborated with the various credit card issuers. And that certification is something that covers the fundamentals, security, and applications of data management as related to payment industries, payment networks, payment terminals, and the certifications and requirements, EMV migration. And for this, we have a worldwide audience. CSCIP-G, that is something that is focused specifically on the U.S. federal government. We there have security, applications, and data management. We have the identity and access control use models as related to ICAM and FIPS 201. We have mobile and near field usage model, and it is all very specific to government FIPS 201 and identity management and credentialing. Some agencies requires this certification for their own employees, and some agencies require this for contractors and contracting staff that are part of the identity management portion. We have one that is a 3-day course, and that is one that has seen a lot of activity in the past few years. It is Certified System Engineer for ICAM PACS, and it is focused on federal requirements on how to certify and correctly design, deploy, test, and perform lifecycle management on GSA FIPS 201 APL tested equipment that are included on the GSA approved product list. It is both a lecture and a hands-on on different authentication factors, different policies that governs both issuance and deployment and use of the credentials. We have a new component here that is called PACS Meet LACS, and that has been created to comply and satisfy OMB A130 that we'll talk more about here later on today. Students convert the PACS username and password for logon to two-factor smart card authentication for logging on. A growing number of agencies have CSCIP as a prerequisite to even submit proposals and bid on federal access control programs. And this reaches out to both Schedule 70 IT contract holders and Schedule 84 security contract holders. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, OMB A130 clearly states and reinforces that PACS is now part of the federal IT infrastructure. And you can think of it as physical and logical access control actually meet. Compliance is not optional, and it is not impossible. And we're going to hear some more details about this here today. But first, I would also, before we go further, I would also like to recognize Steve Rogers from IQ Devices that contributed to this material that we are presenting here today. Session number 1, that is something that we presented here on October 19th, 2017. And that is something that introduced the series of webinars that we are now presenting, that talked about what was going to be presented and the different stakeholders for each different segment. Session number 2, that was the last one, that was November 30th, and we talked about facility characterization, risk, and threat assessment. And today, I am very pleased to turn over the podium for Mike Steffler, and we're going to talk about today about the establishing scope of work.
Great, thanks so much, Lars, and welcome everyone. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast and most of us here on the East Coast probably. So what today we're going to do, is you can see from the prior two webinars, a very building-centric, security-centric characterization of buildings and very nuts and bolts. What we're going to do today in the session 3 agenda is we're going to elevate this discussion and talk about the bigger picture as well as PAC, but how it fits in, as Lars has mentioned repeatedly, the integration of logical and physical access and why this is important. So what we're going to do here is talk about the project in greater abstraction than just a door reader and a PACS. We're going to talk about a whole project, and we're going to talk about how the government's regulatory ecosystem affects the design and the deployment of these kind of systems. This is not, PACs have been deployed for 30, 40 years. The way they're deployed today in the government, the way they're expected to be used, is a much bigger issue and a much more secure issue and a much more complex issue than it's ever been before. So we're going to look at how the government regulatory oversight and landscape really affects the design. Clearly, the number 3, developing a solution for your agency. This is what everyone is after. This is what everyone needs, but we have to take into consideration, of course, these regulatory oversight. We're going to look after we talk about how to really develop the solution, how to identify the overall solution provider qualifications. So this is your primary integrator, your primary providers that are going to come in and manage this project, and we're going to talk about exactly what you should look for there. And finally, the qualifying of approved products. We will talk about where to find these kinds of products in a solution like this. So let's just start here. We're just going to talk about the big picture here. There's a number of different government regulatory requirements and direction and roadmaps and so forth that apply. The first one is, as Lars already mentioned, the Circular A130. This was a rewrite that occurred about 18 months ago, and for the first time ever, it does include federal facilities and credentials and for employees and contractors accessing federal facilities as part of its overall scope. And the quote that Lars had up before, that physical access controls are, guess what? They are IT systems. You cannot achieve GSA, APL, PACS compliance without treating these as IT systems. And so there's a whole new consideration being given, which is really why we're having this webinar towards how these PACs need to be applied today and had to be deployed today. So they are IT systems. They're not stovepipe. They need to work within the larger enterprise systems at a government agency or a department. First thing we'll take a look at are one of the things we'll take a look at here is the GSA APL FIPS 201 evaluation program. This really is the program which qualifies the physical access control systems that can be used and deployed and are approved and will be guaranteed pretty much to work according to a system configuration, work and solve the problem. These are tested by the GSA and are certified that they will achieve the objectives of the FICAM and the other directives. We are going to spend a fair amount of time today on FICAM. FICAM is a multi-dimension object here. This is not just a PIV reader. It's everything around the whole ecosystem of connecting and automating processes and procedures to control authentication and authorization. And of course, I think most of us know, back now dating, six years now, OMB 1111 came out and directed all federal agencies and departments to use the FICAM in its design and implementation, both for logical and physical access. More recently, the Continuous Diagnostics Mitigation Program. This is a program some of you may or may not be familiar with. This program is directed by the DHS and partnerships with GSA, and it is really a cybersecurity program. The entire intent is to monitor all systems for their current behavior and to make sure that they're in compliance and that any defects that are found are reported up so they can be quickly taken care of. So within the CDM program, there's phase 1, 2, 3. The phase 2 is about identity management. So this is the applicable area, and we can talk more about this later, but CDM phase 2 actually refers back to FICAM. So in my mind, if you do FICAM right, you're also achieving the CDM phase 2 requirements. And finally, we're going to start off with, we're going to start off here with Mike in just a minute. This is really where it all began, right? This is FIPS 201. This is what we define to be the card and how the card is to be used, the authentication modes, and then the NIST Special Publications 800-116 is currently under revision. These two documents are really the fundamental guiding documents to get started with PIV and PACS and to understand what you need to do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this now over to Mike and let him continue on.
Thank you, Mark. So we left off in our last session talking about overall risk identification and mitigation. This series, is about PACS-enabled physical access control. So I want to dig a little deeper and look at how the PIV card works to mitigate the risk we've identified. And most of this stuff comes from, as Mark pointed out, from PIPS 201-2 and from NIST Special Publication 800-116. So you'll see references to those throughout as I go through the next few slides. In a traditional PACS, there are essentially two authentication mechanisms. The most common by far is just to present a card. If you need access to more secure spaces, you may also need a PIN. And the static number that's on the card is used to determine what access is authorized. Problem is that the cards are easy to copy. There's no mechanism to prove the card is being presented by the person it's issued to, and the PIN could be shared, stolen, or guessed. In FIPS 201-2, it defines 8 authentication mechanisms for a PIV card that provide enhanced security and meet HSPD 12 requirements. The language is actually graduated criteria to ensure flexibility in selecting the appropriate level of security. That's a quote right from HSPD 12. The authentication mechanisms you select determine how effective the risk mitigation will be and has a significant impact in determining your PACS architecture. There are some practical and technical advantages as well as disadvantages to each authentication mechanism. So let's look at each of those. The first one is visual authentication. Security personnel simply look at the card, signs of fraud or tampering, and they compare the picture to on the card to the person who presented it. Nothing is done electronically, so it doesn't impact the PACS design. The recurring cost for security personnel makes this an extremely expensive authentication mechanism, and it's prone to human error. Next one is the CHUID. The CHUID is a static number stored in the card and read through the card's contact or contactless interface. CHUID authentication is similar to the legacy PACS card authentication. It can be used for rapid authentication at high volume access control points, but it doesn't prevent use of the card by someone other than the person it was issued to. And it doesn't prevent use of a revoked card. Right now, the current recommendation is to only use CHUID and visual authentication together. NIST intends to actually remove both of those authentication mechanisms in the next revision to FIPS 201. Authentication using the Card Authentication Certificate, or PKI CAKE, addresses some of the vulnerabilities inherent with CHUID authentication. As the name implies, it uses a federal public key infrastructure certificate. The certificate is read from the contactless interface of the card. The status of that certificate is obtained from the issuing certificate authority, and that shows us that the card hasn't been revoked. And then a challenge response is performed to ensure the card hasn't been electronically altered. The CAKE was an optional mechanism, authentication mechanism, in an earlier version of the standard, but you'll still see quite a few cards in circulation today without one because of that. It's now mandatory. This is particularly true with DoD cards. The symmetric card authentication key was intended to provide the same advantages as the CAKE, using a symmetric key instead of a PKI certificate to improve speed. It's still part of the standard, but I grayed it out since it really isn't widely used now that the CAKE is mandatory. With biometric authentication, the reader attempts to match the template stored on the card against templates generated from live samples. Fingerprint was the only modality in the original standard. We now also have iris, but I'm not aware of anybody using the iris containers on the card yet. The only difference between Bio and BioA, which is the attended biometric, is procedural. And really that's only intended to protect from the possibility of substitution attacks because you have somebody actually witnessing the capture of the live sample. One of the concerns with Bio and BioA is the compromise of the biometric information once it leaves the card, so between the card and the reader. Processing capacity in cards has improved, so it's now possible to perform the biometric match on the card instead of the reader. And that reduces the risk and improves privacy protections. FIPS 201 has been revised to take advantage of this capability, but again, nobody's really implemented any of that yet that I'm aware of. Last authentication mechanism is the PIV Authentication Certificate. It also uses a federal public key infrastructure certificate, but the certificate can only be accessed through the contact interface of the card and only after a valid PIN has been entered or an on-card biometric match has been made. When used together, visual and electronic format of the PIV card and the authentication mechanism mitigate some of the threats associated with traditional access control cards. You'll see here I listed some of the threats from Section 4 of NIST Special Publication 80116. Unique identifiers are assigned using a common scheme to eliminate collisions. PKI certificates allow the identification of revoked or terminated cards regardless of who issued it. Overt and covert visual security features reduce the potential for counterfeiting. The limited range of the contactless interface and the limited amount of information available through it minimize the threat from skimming and sniffing. PKI auth and PKI cake mitigate the threat of electronically cloned cards, and digitally signed data on the card make it difficult to change the data on the card without being detected. Next slide, please. So some of you may have heard the term level of assurance, or LOA. That concept was introduced by the Office of Management and Budget for electronic transactions requiring authentication in 2004. They have a memorandum where this was established, OMB Memorandum M0404, and it established 4 levels of identity assurance, ranging from little or no confidence to very high confidence. And it described the method for determining what level of assurance you should be using based on the potential impact that an error in identity authentication would have. In other words, it was risk-based. The assurance level itself is based on the strength of the PIV identity proofing, registration, issuance, and maintenance processes, that along with the authentication mechanisms you select. We talked in the other sessions about the policies, procedures, and the technology working together. This is a good example of that. On the bottom of the slide, I included a table from 201-2, so you can see how each of the authentication mechanisms, the PIV authentication mechanisms, map to the LOAs. Next slide, please. Since the PIV identity proofing, registration, issuance, and maintenance processes have been standardized, you may be asking what was used to map the LOA to the different authentication mechanisms. It's based on the number of authentication factors within an authentication mechanism. Many of you have probably heard this before, but there are 3 ways you can authenticate your identity: through something you have, like a key or a card; something you know, like a PIN or a password; or something you are, typically a biometric in this context. This slide shows the factors that are verified when using each of the PIV authentication mechanisms. A few things to note. First is that the CHUIT and VIS are being shown here, used together like we talked about earlier. Second, there are 2 ways to access the certificate when using PKI auth. When a PIN is used, it proves something you know. When OCC auth, or on-card comparison authentication, is used to access a certificate, it proves something you are. Remember I said earlier that OCC auth is relatively new and hasn't been widely adopted yet. Finally, notice the last 2 rows in the chart. In these 2 examples, authentication mechanisms are combined to provide 3 authentication factors. Appendix C of Special Pub 80116 has more information about combining authentication mechanisms. Next slide, please. So you may remember from the last session when we used this plan view of a typical facility to show how we created zones within our facility. Based on the location of the assets in the facility and the level of risk to those assets, we were able to divide things up into zones. In most of the facilities, there's a relatively low level of risk, but we still want to maintain some level of control, so the areas require one authentication factor. In areas like the lab and security, there's a moderate level of risk, so 2 factors are required. And our assessment, our hypothetical assessment also determined the risk was greatest in the IT server room, so 3 factors are required. The PACS and the PIV card mitigate those risks by requiring different levels of assurance to gain access to these areas. Next slide. So here's how this is depicted in the table from 800-116. It recommends a single authentication factor to gain access to the relatively low risk or controlled areas, shown in green. 2 authentication factors to gain access to moderate risk or limited areas, shown in orange. And 3 factors to access high risk or exclusion areas, shown in red. In addition to the number of factors, there are several other things to consider when selecting authentication mechanisms. The first is the assurance level, which we've already talked about. The next one is availability. For example, if your facility needs to accept cards from other agencies, if so, you'll need to remember that some of the authentication mechanisms are optional. They may be available on your card, but not on cards issued by other agencies. In that case, you should limit your selections to mandatory authentication mechanisms. Also remember that some mandatory mechanisms were originally optional. Cards generally have a 2 to 3 year life cycle, so changing the standard takes some time to be fully implemented. And finally, consider the impact on operations. Higher assurance levels and more authentication factors typically takes more time, so they're not appropriate where higher throughput is required. There's always a balance between security and convenience. You may end up increasing risk instead of reducing it. If access becomes overly burdensome, users may subvert your efforts by things like allowing other people to piggyback and propping doors open. Next slide, please. Once the authentication mechanism has been selected, you can begin selecting the equipment you need to support them. I recommend starting with the types and numbers of authentication factors and quantities of readers you'll need. For each one, you'll need to determine what interface to use between the card and the reader, whether it's contact or contactless, how feedback will be provided to the users, for example, through LEDs and LCD display, audio enunciator, and whether you'll need things like keypads or biometric sensors. Reader communication to the controller has traditionally been one direction, from the reader to the controller using weekend or serial protocols, some of which were proprietary. The PIV authentication mechanisms require more user feedback, so bidirectional communication is becoming much more common. It's almost a requirement now and becoming standards-based. The PACS validation systems used to register certificates from cards will be used at your facility and for checking the status of the certificates during authentication. This is most commonly done through certificate revocation list or CRLs and online certificate status protocol responders. The server-based certificate validation protocol, SCVP, may also be used, but it hasn't been widely adopted. Controllers in the PACS infrastructure compare the information stored in the PACS database with the information received from the readers to make an authorization decision. The PACS application software servers and workstations are used to configure and monitor the system. Together, these 3 groups form topologies that are the basis for the GSA FIPS 201 evaluation program approved products list. We'll look at a lot more detail in the next session about procurement. Remember that the PACS is only one tool to mitigate risk, and it's just one of the many information systems that, along with identity and credential information it uses, must be managed at the enterprise level to be efficient. With that, I want to turn it back over to Mark to talk about how PACS fits into the FICAM roadmap.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. And I think that was a great lead-in because enterprise PACS is more than just the endpoint PACS system that can authenticate cards at the door and let people in or not let people in. It's a much bigger issue than that, and the modernization of IT in the government is vital. The protection of PII is vital, and PACS modernization has been something that we've been trying to achieve in the government for some time. And what it involves is integrating all these disparate PACS, sometimes disparate PACS, sometimes a single PACS, at the enterprise level to achieve cost savings and efficiencies while preserving the local access control decisions. Because you think about it, most departments or agencies have offices nationwide, or certainly within a larger area than just one building. So you need to have local control, because each building may have a different security profile, as Mike has talked about before. So that's important to have local control, but have an enterprise PACS where you can bring everything together. So what does a modern PACS do? It leverages the user identity from an authoritative source. So we bring in the identities, the people, and their credentials from authoritative sources. These authoritative sources are things like HR systems, and they are maintained in other areas of the organization. They're not maintained by physical security. They're maintained by the HR function, or the some type of badging function, or whatever is going on in that particular agency, depending on how they get their PIV cards. So what they need to do, though, a modernized PACS will support all the enterprise resources. It will create privilege and policy, or not create policy processes, but it'll support the policy processes and be able to program the privilege of a user to access a door or facility based upon the management policies that are at that organization or at that building. So this is a much bigger issue of authorization than just merely authentication. So we want to make sure that we get the right people in the doors at the right time. So when you look at FICAM, this FICAM is a 400-page document. It really is a really good read, but not all of it, of course, is applicable to PACS. So what happened is the CIO Council said, hey, let's just talk about what part is applicable to LACS and what part is applicable to PACS. So on the right is LACS and Enterprise PACS on the left. But I think what's striking when you just look at these side by side is there's not a lot of difference. Both of these talk about identity management, credential management, resource management, privilege management, policy management as being inputs into what you actually get access to, be it a logical access resource or physical access resource. So with that, I think that the concept here is that FICAM is really about convergence of all access and all authorization. So physical and access controls are held to the same standard regardless. And this is a big change in PACS, because typically in PACS in the past, the security offices managed these PACS as stovepipes, as through manual methods with paper-based methods, and of course accountable for that. Whereas on the IT side, they're very much more comfortable with this LACS. So it really is a matter of modernizing the mindset and the whole approach around PACS. So let's just take a quick look at this diagram that we saw here in that summary brochure. The things to note here are that, again, the user accounts are provisioned from an authoritative source. So those authoritative sources are managed and maintained by other parts of the organization, which tells you immediately you need to have more stakeholders involved to do an enterprise PACS implementation. Of course, we know that there are PIV and PIV-I cards. Now the GSA US Access actually will issue PIV-I cards as well as PIV, and possibly even CAC if you're coming from the military side of the house. On the right-hand side here, what does this really mean in physical access? So resources, what are resources? Resources are doors. Could be a single factor authentication door. It could be a turnstile. It could be a parking lot, your arm that goes up and down based upon your car's license plate. That is a resource. You're getting access to some physical resource. The privilege is what entitlements do you get? Like, for instance, if you're an employee at Department of Transportation, you can go to New Jersey to the turnstile because you're a Department of Transportation employee. So that's your entitlement. The privilege may be something that is tied to aspects of your identity, such as training or security clearance. You may not get access. Mike mentioned earlier the three-factor authentication for a data center. Well, not only is it 3 factors of authentication to make sure that you got the right person in one data center, who even gets that authorization in the first place is a matter of privilege management, and what kind of credentials and controls and approvals that person gets for what period of time to get this privileged access. And all of that is defined in the policy. So the policy has to be created in a system in order to implement and conform to this policy. So I'm going to use 2 diagrams here out of the FICAM document that talks about enterprise PACS and PACS modernization. This first one is really kind of a notional topology of how these things fit together. So again, we got these authoritative sources of information, such as identities. When someone comes into an organization, they're onboarded into the HR system. They're usually given some type of Active Directory account or other LDAP account. and you have maybe an IDMS where their badge is created, their PIV card is created, and so forth. You may have contractors who come into a contractor database and so forth. So each of these authoritative sources is usually maintained by an organization who's chartered with the accurate employment of information in these sources. So that's perfect, because what we want to do then is bring, what FICAM says do, is bring those identities in and provision those into physical access systems, making sure that the certificates on the cards are valid and that they're not revoked. And so what is the glue that does this? We know all these piece parts. Here's the thing that's commonly missing in many organizations is the FICAM calls the thing a cardholder provisioning system, an external interface, and visitor management system. So this is obviously visitors management is obviously for we're managing visitors. The cardholder provisioning is for employees and public contractors who have PIV cards or PIV-I cards. So what is this piece? This is the glue that brings these things together, that helps modernize this PACS. And what I want to do next is talk about what is the feature function aspect of this cardholder provisioning system. So if we look at, this is in chapter 4 of the FICAM document. And what you see here is, again, the authoritative source, so some type of an interface to bring these identities into this next thing up. What is this thing? This is, again, the same notional block as before, the cardholder provisioning system and possibly visitor management. What this product does, or what this capability is to create business rules, i.e. security policy rules, and to get attributes of identity such as training, security clearance, location, etc., any kind of credentials the person might have to carry a weapon or to do something medically or whatever. So all these attributes of the identity are in here, and the business rules are programmed into this system. And the policy administration is obviously to create these rules. And then you have the bind and unbind at the top there. That is to bind or unbind a PIV card from an identity. So, hey, people get a PIV card and they use it, and then guess what? A year goes by and they lose it. So the PIV card is revoked, it's terminated, they get a new PIV card. But this person may have been provisioned into many different systems. So what you want to do is you simply want to bind the new PIV card, unbind the old one, bind the new one, and all the identities access levels are immediately assigned to the new card. And so the whole idea around all this is automation. You shouldn't have to go through manually and re-provision every single access. So the privilege lifecycle management is all part of this whole workflow, and this workflow is essentially an automated system. So in support of that, sometimes requests are created to create, I need access to a new door. So rather than, again, filling out paperwork, sending emails and phone calls, you should be able to go right to a system in some type of self-service portal or some other way to electronically request the access you need for an additional privilege or to do deprovision access. So once these identities are onboarded, the PIV cards are onboarded, and the workflows are run and the business rules are applied, in the end, what happens is you're going to provision in the PACS world a card holder, a card record, which is the PIV card, and the access levels associated with that PIV card into the PACS. So that's a pretty straightforward concept. The user should be notified of all the changes. Their security clearance changes. They lose access to a particular door through automated means because it requires a higher security clearance level. And guess what? You need to notify them so they don't try to use that door and become frustrated. Likewise, if they requested new access and it got approved, you would want to notify them. So keeping the user notified and enable him to understand, or her, what access they currently have is a vital part of the FICAM to improve the user experience. And finally, audit. Okay, I think everyone knows how vital audit is. If you can't prove that the people who have access to secure doors maintain that access, or that door has not, for instance, that door has not changed its authentication level, you need some way of auditing that the target state is concurrent with the as-is state that's in your system. So audit is a big part of FICAM, and it's a wonderful tool to use to ensure your security. So if we look at security and risk mitigated by an enterprise PACS, again, because only assured identities that are sourced from an authoritative source are going to get provisioned in the PACS. When you manually enroll cards, They may or may not be at that agency, but if you're connected to the agency's HR system and their own PIV card database, for instance, you're going to make sure that only the assured identities from that agency or that department are provisioned into PACS. Clearly, only valid PIV cards are going to be provisioned because guess what? If you're connected to the PIV card system and the PIV card becomes revoked, it's going to be revoked first in that system. It may not even appear on the CRLs for up to 18 hours, but if you're connected to the authoritative source for PIV cards, bang, you will know immediately if those cards are new and they're valid or not. So if the card becomes invalid because it's expired, placed in the CRL, again, that will be immediately notified into the cardholder provisioning system, and then automated processes to deprovision access for that expired card would take place. And again, any identities terminated from employment, whether they resign normally or they're walked out the door for some reason or what have you. Again, the point here is that over the life cycle of a person in government, they may work in an agency for 10 years and gain access to 18 different buildings across the nation. How do you know that you're going to immediately take away all that access when they leave the organization? This is a manual process right now. And it's a huge area of risk. So, and especially now, there's a big kind of concept that's really come to the fore, which is privileged access, which is if you have privileged access, such as the data center, then you want to make absolutely sure that only people who have and need that privileged access maintain that access for only the period of time that they need it, and all of the requirements, the pre-requirements like training or what have you, are met by the individual. If any of that training terminates or changes, then they may need to lose access to that door until they reapply and are approved in a different way or what have you. So really managing this elevated or privileged access is a huge risk and something that needs to be carefully monitored and audited in an organization. The ability to perform these audits, we talked about that, is vital. And I think also the government's been active trying to protect PII, and we've all read the headlines for years about all the PII being stolen from the government through hacking and what have you. The point here is that in PACS, traditionally, a lot of PII ends up in PACS because they're manually managed. And really what you want to do is you want to keep all that PII out. The only thing you really need in PACS in the end, really, is a credential number to note whether or not that credential number gets access to a particular door or not. So removing the PII from the endpoint PACS really helps protect it. And for any of those of you on the phone who are familiar with the European standard, the GDPR, this is a huge emphasis in Europe with huge financial penalties when PII is not protected properly. And I think all of us in our modern world are concerned with this. Look, what does this all boil down to? What it really means is, what does it really mean to you and your organization? It means that you can get the right people with the right IDs, the right access for the right reasons at the right times. I mean, it really does boil down to that. It's a very tough thing to do manually, but with automated tools and with provisioning workflows and so forth and engines like this, you can achieve this at a fairly reasonable cost. So Gartner often talks about this in their conferences, and I've even heard Jim Shire over at GSA mention this many times. So this concept is not unique to government, but it is the end state that government, in fact, all large secure enterprises need to get to. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike to talk about gap analysis.
Okay, thanks again, Mark. So we've already gone through, we've done our current state assessments, and we know what our desired end state is. The next step of the process is to perform a gap analysis so that we can finalize our scope. It's pretty easy to do this for a new installation, so there's no concerns about CAD compatibility or transition strategies. Unfortunately, it's the least common scenario. So you may need a consultant or an integrator or a manufacturer sales engineer to identify areas that could be problematic from that perspective. We already talked about the cardholder locations and quantities. What's important here is knowing how these choices impact things like software licenses and storage requirements. In some cases, the need for bidirectional reader communication may require new cabling. When we talk about network communication, you need to understand that the PACS will need to communicate to external locations over the network to obtain certificate statuses and CRLs. Many of the legacy PACS systems were installed on isolated standalone networks, so changes to the network may be needed here. make sure you define your availability requirements from both the network and the server perspective. They need to align with your policies and procedures for monitoring and responding to access control events in case there's ever any issues. We spoke earlier about the external system integration requirements. That may not have changed depending on how your specification's written, but if it did, you need to make sure that those changes are clearly defined in your scope. And finally, don't forget about the environmental factors. You need to define any changes that are needed in HVAC, power, and even physical space for equipment. Keep in mind, you may have to support both the old and the new systems or portions of them in parallel for a period of time, depending on your actual transition strategy. Next slide. So let's tie it all together and finalize the scope. Once your gap analysis is done, you can finalize it, finalize everything. You need to document, first and foremost, what risk will be mitigated and what risk will be accepted. Your scope documentation should clearly define the roles and responsibilities for the project. You'll need to assess the capabilities within your organization, decide which pieces of the project you'll self-perform and which ones you'll issue contracts for. The most important part of this step is commitment. No matter whether it's internal or external, the people, the organizations need to make firm commitments to providing the resources and meeting your project schedules. Your system specification can take a bunch of different forms. In some cases, you'll need to require specific products to maintain compatibility with legacy pieces that you're planning on reusing. That may limit your options for the integrators. This approach also means you'll have already determined that the product meets your needs. If it doesn't, it's your responsibility. The other way to do this is for you to specify the functions that the products must perform and let the contractor make that selection and become responsible that it'll meet those functional requirements. As you finalize your scope, you also need to make one last check of your budget and schedule estimates. If the costs are too high or the schedule is too long, you may need to break the project into smaller portions. And you want to start with the areas that deliver the biggest risk reduction. 801.16 provides a PIV implementation maturity model, which is a tool that may help you here in breaking those down into smaller pieces. If schedule is an issue, you may need to consider shifting the balance in the work that's being self-performed and the work that you're contracting out. The final and most important part of the project is acceptance by the executive sponsor. Your project's a lot more likely to fail without this support. Once you have the supporter, you can start the process of selecting providers. I'm going to turn it back over to Mark one last time to talk about that.
Thank you, Mike. This is really common sense, right? What your solution provider, this is your primary integrator, the person is going, or the organization is going to help you. So really what you want to make sure is as you define the scope and you know what the complete scope is, hardware, software, building, any construction, whatever, you need to make sure that the solution provider that you characterize this, that they have the capability for this, to support the entire scope of the project. So again, if it's just a software upgrade, it means one thing. If it's involving construction, pulling wires, mounting things on walls, elaborate crossovers from one PACS to another, you need a different set of capabilities. With this, look, it's quite common that no one organization can do every single thing well. So the ability to partner with experts in certain areas of implementation and subject matter experts is also vital. So we think partnering teams create stronger teams. Of course, experience again. First of all, make sure that the products you're proposing, that these organizations have our relationships with the manufacturers to gain support. Obviously, prior history, the qualifications for similar deployments. Again, these PACS projects are not like they used to be. There's more moving parts, there's more complexity, and there's more requirements. Doing a really good system design is more important than ever. So making sure that this skill set is somewhere in the suite of the partners and the prime contractor is important. Obviously, project management, this doesn't change, and good communication skills and capabilities with the user. Finally, the certifications are required. At the beginning of this hour, Lars mentioned the CSIEP So the certified system engineers for ICAM PACS, this is really absolutely a required thing. And if for some reason this is not in your procurement, it needs to be in there. And all the other relevant certifications, again, depending on the scope of the project, how much software and hardware. Look, no matter who you selected for your prime contractor and your main partner, that contract may be a 5-year contract. Eventually it's going to be recompeted. Eventually you may have a different solution partner to maintain, but you're going to be stuck with the products you choose probably for a fairly long time. The life cycle of a PAC system is anywhere from 10 to 20 years, and software, ripping and replacing software is very disruptive. And so you want to make sure that you buy approved software, the government's approved software, and hardware. So where are you going to find that? So for PACS, you're going to find that at the ID Management Gov site. Mike talked earlier about the readers, the validation and infrastructure. Every combination of compliant and proven, tested system is listed in that website. So we would certainly urge you to make sure that any award you make would be PACS equipment coming out of that website. Enterprise PACS software is a little bit trickier, perhaps. There is no category in the GSA APL for a FICAM cardholder management system and the provisioning workflows and so forth. The closest thing we could come up, or we could help you with, is look at the GSA DHS CDM, the Continuous Diagnostic Mitigation Program. They do have an APL, and just recently stood that up in September. And so they can actually, they will approve software and COT software for the CDM program. As I mentioned before, phase 2 is about identity management, and bound P is boundary physical. So there's bound N and bound F, but bound P is really what relates to physical access, and phase 2 is identity management. So there's a special SIN, and you can look there for software. That's the best we can do coming from an actual certification. But really, what's really important is on the right. Make sure and look at the 800-116. There's enumerated requirements. And more importantly, the FICAM roadmap, we talked about that much earlier. At the end of the FICAM, you will find 8 solution characteristics. These are essentially kind of compliance matrix. If you look at those and make sure that you look at the PACS solution characteristics, automated provisioning solution characteristics, and visitor management. So depending on the scope, these are the 3 solution characteristics. You want to make sure every box is checked for the software that you select for your system there. With that, I'd like to turn that back over to Lars.
Thank you, Mark. And next slide, please. So this is session number 3. Session number 4 that will be presented on February 22nd. That will deal with how, from an agency perspective, they develop a procurement strategy. And the procurement strategy include and determine responsibilities within the agency for the various tasks and various phases of the procurement. That standards at the end state system is actually adhered to. Procurement vehicles, Schedule 70 and Schedule 84, draft contract documents, and obtain funding, evaluate proposals, and award contracts. We have speakers for that session from GSA headquarters here in Washington, D.C., from GSA Fort Worth in Texas, and from the U.S. Capitol Police here in Washington, D.C. Session number 5. That will be then, what does the vendors do that is awarded this contract? Establish the schedule, identify responsibilities for dependencies, develop monitoring and reporting plan, like Mark just mentioned here, communicate with the customer, finalize the system design, install and configure, test, and do the cutover and closeout and documentation and lifecycle management. And then session number 6, that will be the last one. That will be a little bit different format. We will then have a panel of discussions. We will have members from both federal agencies, from system manufacturers and system integrators. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Randy for question and answer. Next slides, please.
Okay, thank you, Lars, and also for Mark and Mike for some great content today. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and Lars, since you were just talking, here's a question I think you could answer. Coming from an integrator, what FAR regulation can I use to convince the contracting officer that they need to purchase products that are compliant and could be used in a fully compliant solution?
Oh, thank you. That's a good one, Randy. There is suggested procurement language in both the idmanagement.gov website. It talks about the requirement of using APL listed equipment and certified service providers. That is a statement that is a requirement both in OMB A130, it is on the GSA procurement language, and there is another GSA site that is called gsa.gov, and that is a Schedule 84 contract vehicle. And in there is a statement that all the equipment shall be selected from the GSA APL that you can find on idmanagement.gov website, and the proposed equipment shall have the approval number for all the categories, the PACS infrastructure, the certificate validation system, and the readers. And it also states that CSCIP certification of certified installation and service provider is a prerequisite to even submit a bid and propose to those contracts. So contract vehicles, both Schedule 70, idmanagement.gov, and Schedule 84, gsa.gov.
Yeah, and I'll just add that for anybody else on the call today who is in a similar situation, please contact Lars directly. He gets involved in these types of issues on a regular basis, and he has a wealth of resources that he can provide you to help convince a contracting officer how to do the right thing. So thank you. Question next. This one is for oh, I lost it. Hold on one second. For Mike. Doesn't the OCC auth require a PIN to decrypt the bio template?
No, it does not. The template is stored on the card. It is protected through PIN. It is digitally signed. But the channel, the only thing you're trying to protect here is the transmission of the live sample from the reader into the card. And that's being done through establishment of a secure messaging session. All that protocol is defined in 873-4 Part 2.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I think this question was for Mark, but Mike, you might be able to answer this as well. How should we budget to upgrade an existing non-PIV compliant PACS and enterprise PACS software system to achieve what you suggest? I guess suggesting a PIV compliant solution.
That's kind of a loaded question, only because it depends on what you're trying to upgrade. You know, when we do our current state and our desired state definitions, we'll have a pretty good handle. If you haven't been given a budget target in advance, you'll have a pretty good handle on where you need to go as far as are you just upgrading readers? Do you have to go panels? Do you have to do an entire system? How many infrastructure changes do you make? So without having that current state, desired end state, and the gap analysis done, you really won't know for sure how you estimate or how to budget for it. So I would start with those if you haven't been given a budget target, and then look at the size of your project and the equipment you're going to have to replace.
Okay, 1 minute left. Mike, or Mark rather, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just say that I would just guide the user to two metrics. Again, the number of doors that you're going to need access control on is one metric. It could be 100, it could be 1,000, it could be whatever. But obviously, there's some cost per door, net all in, to put in PACS. And then typically the number of identities, the number of people that are going to be part of this system. So those are the two primary metrics. I think that potentially we can come up with guidelines for between this much money and this much money per user, and between this much money and this much money for PACS. But again, as Mike mentioned, depending on how far you're going. So, but those two metrics, I think, if you can come up with the number of identities that are going to be involved in this PACS transformation and the number of doors, you can begin to use those as rough guidelines. And I think that we probably take offline the conversation around what are the ranges of cost per door and per identity that to do everything you need to do. But those are two metrics that I think if you had those, your consultants would be better able to help you kind of guide what your budget requirements are going to be.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And sorry we weren't able to get to more of your questions, but I see that we're at the top of the hour here, so we'll end today's webinar here. You have some good contact information here in front of you if you'd like to follow up with any of our presenters today or send a general inquiry to the Secure Technology Alliance. Please use one of those email addresses to do so. Today's participants will get an email from the Secure Technology Alliance with a link to the recording and the content presented today. And you are welcome to share that link and information with other colleagues in your organization who may have missed today's live presentation. Hope you enjoyed today's content, and hopefully you will schedule your participation in the future webinars in the series. Thank you all and have a great day.